Hey everybody, this is Kerry Schertz, the Backyard Professor. I just recently played a game against an opponent of mine that illustrates one of the important principles of the Jeremy Silman imbalances idea that I think is worth taking a look at. I'm playing white. I opened with queen pawn opening. He pushes the knight and I open. You can see at this point, the first few moves, we're establishing a serious battle for the center, which is the most important part of the board because all power radiates from the center. You see that we're really trying to get this game going here. At this point, there's no definite plan as such, but he does exchange the pawn, threatening my bishop, and I take. Now, at this point, I have a really wonderful diagonal right there. You can see that diagonal coming into play, and that weak f7 pawn, which is only guarded by the king, of course, that's what makes it weak. But this diagonal, I keep my bishop because this diagonal becomes very important in the later part of the game. Now he's challenging my bishop, and I want to keep my bishop on that diagonal so that I simply pull it back to b3. I keep good central control through the d5 and c4 squares as well. Now we can see I've still got that diagonal, and now it's even opening up even further as he presses his pawn, and again he's challenging the d4 square with his pawn. There. I've got it covered with my knight and pawn and queen, however, so that's I'm okay. So I went ahead and took him because I was thinking I'm going to try to get that knight as a defender off the board, and he brings his pawn here, of course, threatening my knight. So what do I do in this case? I go ahead and take his knight. He retakes my knight with a pawn, so I move my knight out of trouble in front of my king. And we see that he's got his pawns are doubled up. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the doubled up pawns, of course, he's got this square that he controls and this square in the E file, and he now has an open file right there. So he's getting a little bit of interesting development here. And he does push his rook to gain that open file. I decide to castle, and he moves his rook back out of the open file. Now that's not the way to play rooks in open files. He should have just simply kept that open file and come right at the king. It's leading directly to my king's side. So I believe this is a weak move on his part. In fact, I would classify that as an outright error. Oop, I went one too fast. I move my rook here as an open file. Now, it's true I have a pawn on e3, but heading it toward those doubled pawns up here, I'm going to be able to change out that pawn with this one, so that I'm going to have an open file. And we also see that my queen is also pointing in that direction as well, toward his queen, and I have this wonderful diagonal leading right to that f7 pawn. So things are starting to get a little good pressure on his king, and you noticed he hasn't castled yet, and he's already moved his king rook, so he can't castle. He sacrificed the right to castle at this point. When the king stays in the center of the board like that, that's an invitation to go after him. So he develops his bishop up, and I'm already pushing the e-pawn. He brings the bishop back, and I'm pushing that e-pawn. I want this file open for me. He takes with the knight. I retake with my knight. Again, threatening that f7 pawn. And you notice the queens are now ready to exchange each other, perhaps? No, I don't want to exchange the queens. Not yet. He takes the knight with the pawn, undoubling his pawns. I move my queen out of the way. He puts his queen on d6, covering this pawn and indirectly supporting this pawn. And of course, the e5 pawn, which is soon to fall. This diagonal is starting to show now. The pressure of this diagonal is really starting to get to him. Now you'll notice something else. With open files, rooks belong on open files, and my open file here is leading directly to the king. I also have another open file right here. Now, if he decides to make use of that open file before I do, then it's going to be his open file. But you notice now, I also have power coming this way with my queen. So it's a great crisscross pattern here that I'm getting him under some good pressure. I bring my bishop out. I need to bring my whole army into play. He drops his queen back and I press my queen forward. You see my open file thrust, my queen in front of my bishop thrust at this very weak f7 pawn, and my other bishop coming this way. I'm beginning to exert some really good pressure on him. He pulls his bishop back, and I decide I want my other rook in on this, so I bring my other rook over, and I've got an open file leading directly to his queen. Now this pawn becomes bothersome to me. He's got a central pawn here. It's not a very strong pawn. This pawn becomes a bother to me. So what to do about this? He pushes this pawn, of course, to give support to his other pawn. I can't take him yet, so I do the direct approach attack. He takes, I take on the A file, and he brings his bishop up. Now he's supporting these two pawns with his bishop. He's got a pretty good central thrust. He's got a pretty good central bulwark and support. I still have that magnificent angle, the open file pointing directly to his king, and the open file directly pointed to his queen now. I've still got this pressure. His queen, of course, is guarding this pawn. So now he's got some extra support protecting that pawn. So I bring my bishop out to challenge his bishop directly, the dark squared bishop. Or I mean his queen, I'm sorry. And of course he moves his queen over here. So now you can see the dynamics of the board with both of my bishops out in the open and active. His bishop here is behind two pawns, giving them support. He doesn't have any influence whatsoever. His bishop here hasn't even moved yet. My bishops are extremely active, bearing down on the king. And he is in a strictly defensive mode here. He is purely on defense because of the files, the open files where my rooks are, and those diagonals with those bishops. The bishops are proving to be very powerful instruments. Now I switch the open file. I pull it over on the D file, and I head straight up the center because the king has not castled yet. He pulls his bishop back. I exchange bishops, gladly so. Now the queen is still supporting this pawn here, and this pawn here, and this pawn here. The queen is being overworked. She can't do it all. And I'm starting to take notice of this. Now I'm saying, holy cow, I've got a highway right to the king. It's a double lane interstate highway right to the king. This could be getting really good for me. I've got incredible pressure bearing down on him. What do I do here? You notice something else that's interesting. I bring my knight to f4 and I pin his pawn to the king. He can't take my knight. So now I can bring my knight into the game as well, because this rook on that central open file and this rook on that central open file, now I can bring my pawn and put a wicked pin on that pawn and bring my knight into the game. He brings his rook, which gives him, he brings his rook, which gives him an open file of attack on the bishop. I'm not too awful worried about that. In fact, I'm so unworried about that that I went ahead, moved my knight, directly threatened his queen. I want his queen away from this pawn. This pawn is starting to give me fits. I want this pawn gone too. I don't want those two center pawns in there. So I'm trying like crazy to get that queen away from protecting this pawn. I'm trying my best to try to get rid of that queen. It's a tough game at this point. He moves up the queen to d6, protecting those pawns directly. I decide it's worth sacrificing a piece. I'm a piece up. It's worth doing a deflection. I deflect the queen from this pawn. That way I can get rid of that pawn by causing the queen to take my knight. I deliberately put the king in check so that he has to take that knight, which he does, and I take this pawn on c5. Now I have an open access to the king in many regards. Right through that diagonal, right through that diagonal, right through that open file, and right through that open file. Now he's in trouble. His queen is still strictly on a defensive mode. He put his queen in front of his king, so I brought that rook completely... let me go back. I brought that rook up and got rid of that pawn. He put his queen in front of his king on an open file. Now what he's doing is he's threatening, he wants to exchange queens here. He sees too much power here. I don't want to exchange queens yet, so I pin his queen to his king. Now you're beginning to see the power of the open files. He puts the bishop in front of the queen to take the pin off, and I move my bishop right to here, putting his king in check. Notice the queens are ready to exchange with each other. Rather than exchange at this point, because I want that open file for my rook, I have another piece I can put the king directly in check. So he has to move out of check, and I move my queen back out of here again. I don't want to exchange just yet, because now I have double pieces on this open file. He pulls his queen up here, which skewers my rook to my queen, so I moved my rook over to here, and now I've got double rooks on an open file. I've got the queen on her open file. I've got the bishop on the diagonal. I've got the queen on the diagonal, and I've got the queen looking this direction for this open file right here, if I need to use that. I'm cornering the king. You'll notice, you'll notice, this rook has done very little in this game. This rook has done very little in this game. My rooks have been extremely active on the offense. His rooks have been sitting back on the defense. This is because I gained the open files. He pulls his bishop way back out of here, and here's where I do a wonderful, wonderful move to strengthen the center. We must strengthen the center. Notice how that pawn supports the rook. This queen supports the rook. The queen supports the pawn. The rook supports the rook. It's a powerful arrow thrust directly into his territory and in the center. Again, trying to control the center, either through occupation or through influence. Even in the beginning of the end stage of the game, because now the power radiates from the center out. This is very important. And I want to shore up this rook because I don't want my queen to be stuck guarding him, or this other rook guarding him if I can help it. I want to bring the pawns into it as structural supports. You'll notice how scattered his pieces are. This rook is completely unprotected. The bishop way out here is completely unprotected. The queen is absolutely unprotected. Only the queen guards the rook, whereas my pieces are all together in a very good coordinated effort. He pushes his pawn. I bring my bishop back here. Now what I'm thinking is, I'm trying to cut off his escape route of the king in case he decides to go this way. I'm also thinking it might be wise in the endgame to come to here with my bishop and bring my pawn up. That way I can connect those two. In the meantime, he brings his rook up, defending his queen across the aisle, but he gives up the 8th rank. So I go check. Now I've exposed the queens to an exchange. I've checked the king, and I've got this rook back here. He has to move out of check. I now exchange queens. He brings his rook over to exchange queens. I bring my rook over to exchange rooks, and then my rook occupies the 7th rank. Rooks belong on the 7th rank, because now I threaten this pawn here and this pawn here. He moved his king up to protect this pawn, so I move over and chop that pawn off. He brings his bishop up, connecting it to the pawn. Now he's reassembling himself. Now here my position is a little bit loose. I've got a separate pawn here that's kind of loose. I got a bishop over here. I got a pawn over here. I've got a rook way up here. And then I've got this group with the king and the 2 pawns. So it's time for me to organize my groups better. So take the time to put them together in a nice, neat order, all connected, everything's touched. I don't want that pawn to be hanging. He pulls his bishop back on c8. I pull my bishop up. He pulls his rook over to threaten my bishop. It's of no use because I want my bishop over here. He's starting to centralize his king, which is important, and now I finally get my pieces coordinated. I've got my rook on the 7th rank, I've got the pawn connected with the bishop, I've got these pawns in a chain, and my king is ready to march this away into the center. And his king is marching this away. His king is marching this away into the center. That's where kings belong in an endgame, is toward the center. Now that everything's hooked up, what's he do? He centralizes that rook. You notice how he is fighting for the center? So I move my king toward the center. He puts his king on e6. I move my king to e3, threatening his rook. He moves his rook over, and I trap his bishop. His bishop has nowhere to go. Can't go there. It's no good there. He's going to be taken there, and he's going to be taken there. I trap his bishop. He brings his rook back down. I take his bishop. He moves his king over. I believe he was making an error here. I think he should have stayed on this side where the pawn majority is, because he has 2 disconnected pawns. He moves his king over this direction. I think he played on the wrong side of the board, so I'm coming over here to eliminate more pawns. Now he starts zooming back, and I take the pawn. He's trying to centralize his king, and at this point, he resigned. That's a game that illustrates Patrick Silman's imbalance of the rooks and open files, and the idea that when you have a fairly open center, it's always a good thing to have one bishop at least, and make sure that the bishop is on a square like this one was, either here or here, so that they can exert maximum influence into your opponent's position. I had these angles absolutely most of the game, and it put an enormous amount of pressure on the king. It made it so he couldn't castle. So I hope this game has been helpful for you to understand the idea and the power behind the open files.